I, like Peter, am a staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California, and my primary practice is in national security and immigrant rights. And so within that, I deal with a whole host of issues affecting the Muslim community, issues pertaining to some of the issues that we're going to talk about, but also issues pertaining to naturalization applications, green card applications, problems that people have in the immigration system. And there's a lot of crossover, as you probably know, between a lot of the issues that we deal with in the national security side, with the way in which post 9/11 our laws have become much more restrictive and have impacted the Muslim community in ways that are often, we find, to be discriminatory or wrongly applied. And so we're there to help those of you in the community who have issues with your immigration process, as well as the many issues that folks have faced in terms of dealing with the FBI and other types of law enforcement encounters, which is the subject of our talk today.
My name is Peter Biebring. I'm also a staff attorney. I focus my work at the ACLU on police practices, on law enforcement, in all sorts of contexts, in ensuring that law enforcement does not violate the rights of individuals in any context, whether it's an officer stopping somebody on the street or an FBI agent conducting a counterterrorism investigation. I did want to say one or two words on the ACLU and its history, just so you have some understanding of the context. I'm sure many of you may already know, but some of you may not. The ACLU is an organization that is more than almost 90 years old. First started in the 1920s in response to the persecutions of people suspected of being communist. Through the year, the organization is dedicated to protection of constitutional rights. So protection of the rights of individuals from government interference with the way that they speak freely, the way that they practice their religion, their right to be free from intrusive searches in the home or out among the streets, and the right of individuals to be given due process in proceedings against them, among others. Through the course of the ACLU's histories, we have represented many, many different types of individuals persecuted on the basis of their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, their nationality or ethnicity. This affiliate, the one in Los Angeles, was one of the few voices, for example, in World War II that spoke out against the internment of Japanese Americans who were suspected simply by the fact that their parents or grandparents had been born in Japan of posing a danger to the United States, even those people who were born here. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the substance of our presentation. And I thought I'd begin, actually, since I work on police issues generally, with talking about the rights that you have in an ordinary encounter with a police officer on the street. And there's a reason for, I realize that may be not what is troubling most people here when they think about interactions with law enforcement, but I think that that's an interaction that most people here probably feel somewhat comfortable with and more comfortable understanding their rights. And there is actually very little difference in many ways between an interaction with an officer of the sheriff's department or your local police department and an officer from the FBI. There are really only two things that a law enforcement officer can do. One is to ask you questions, and the other thing is to conduct searches or seizures. And there are only two things, broadly speaking, there are two things that you need to keep in mind when you are dealing with each of those situations. When an officer is asking you questions, you need to keep in mind that in almost every circumstance, and there are some exceptions that we'll talk about later, you do not have to answer those questions. When a police officer stops you on the street and asks you what you're doing, where you're going, where you've been, you have the right to remain silent. If you've watched any television in the United States, you know this. It's the first thing that officers say: you have the right to remain silent. They also say you have the right to an attorney. It's part of that right to remain silent is to remain silent until you have had the opportunity to speak with an attorney. And that is true with a police officer who stops you in the car or with an FBI interview. The other thing an officer who stops you can do is try to search your person by patting you down, by looking in your pockets, by opening their bag, or by searching your car or your home. The thing to keep in mind with respect to searches is that you do not have to consent to those searches. That if you want to preserve all your rights against searches, you need to make clear that you are not consenting. This doesn't mean that you grab your bag back from the officer, that you pull away from him when he tries to pat you down. It means that you say loudly and clearly, "I do not consent to this search." The reason for doing this, and just in the officer context or the FBI context, is that there are no rules against trying to trick people. Although you don't have to answer any questions, there's no rule to prevent a police officer, an FBI agent, from coming up to you and asking you any question he or she wants to. No matter how personal, no matter how invasive, no matter how caught off guard. And our natural response as people is to interact with the people that interact with us, to assume that they have a reason for asking those questions, and if they're asking a question that makes us feel uncomfortable, to assume that they have the power to do so, even when it's not true. So an officer may ask you something. Just bear in mind you do not have to answer it. You can remain silent. You can say, "I don't want to answer that question. I don't want to answer any questions. I want to talk to an attorney," in any context. The same thing with searches. I often deal with police officers who want to search the bags of kids who they suspect of being engaged in some kind of funny business. They say things like, "You don't have anything in your bag, illegal in your bag, do you?" The kid says, "No." The officer says, "Well, then you don't mind if I take a look." So at that point, the kid shrugs his or her shoulders, and the officer just opens the bag. The officer has therefore, through some kind of trickery, obtained consent to search the bag. It's very important that you make clear that you are not giving consent to any search. If an officer comes to visit you in your home, you can step outside, say, I do not consent to having you in my house. We can step outside. If an officer asks to search your bag, you can generally say no.
So that's a good framework to discuss what I'm going to discuss next, which is what to do when the FBI knocks at your door or knocks at the door of your employer or your workplace. And the reason why we want to talk about this is because maybe it's obvious, but members of the Muslim community in Southern California have been very heavily monitored by the FBI for reasons that we often think are too intrusive, and that they're basically trolling the community and creating files on individuals they shouldn't be looking at because they're trying to collect sort of a database of people who live in this community and who are practicing Muslims. And so that's part of the reason why we're here to discuss what your rights are, because it's important that everyone knows what to do when the FBI knocks at your door, if they knock at your door. So some of the same principles that Peter discussed applied. The first very important thing to know is that FBI interviews are entirely voluntary, and that goes for pretty much any law enforcement interview of this kind. But in this context, if the FBI calls you, if they knock at your door, if they come to your workplace, you have to know that if they ask to talk with you, it's completely voluntary. You, under no circumstances, have to speak to them. One thing that they might do is they often try to intimidate people and give reasons to make you think that you have to talk to them, but it's important to remember that it is entirely up to you whether to speak with them. Did you want to?
the one thing I wanted to say is unless we say otherwise, unless we make